Welcome to The Right Show with Caroline Sutton. I'm Caroline Sutton. As always, I'd like to introduce you to our partner. Today is America. I'm also excited to announce our new partner, Tampa Bay Young Republicans, as well as the Florida Federation of Young Republicans. They do great work organizing events, promoting local Republican candidates, getting young conservatives involved in the community. We really encourage you to reach out to the Young Republican chapter in your area. Last week you got to meet the Right Team. Today you get to see them in action. I'll be moderating a debate between the Right Team and two liberals over the topic of, would the country be better off today if Hillary had won in 2016? Representing the Right Team is Jackson and Lily. For some background info, Jackson's a senior in high school in Wisconsin, and he hopes to pursue a political career or a career in law enforcement. Lily is coming to us from upstate New York, where she's a freshman in college, and she's pursuing a criminal justice degree. In Hillary's defense, we have Jake and Emily. First, I'd like to thank them for coming on the show. None of this would be possible if we didn't have guests who were willing to come on the show and do this and promote our message of having civil, respectful conversations without personal attacks and everything else that you see nowadays on social media. So we really appreciate them taking part in this. Jake and Emily are both coming to us from Memphis, Tennessee, where they attend Rhodes College, which also happens to be my alma mater. If you're thinking that Rhodes might sound familiar, it probably does. Recently confirmed Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett also went there for undergrad school. So our tiny school with less than 2,000 people had our moment in the spotlight for a few minutes there. Jake is a senior at Rhodes, and he's an international studies major. After graduation, he plans to go to D.C. and work in politics. Emily is a sophomore at Rhodes, and she's a double major in mathematics and economics. In order to first assess this topic, I feel like it's important to acknowledge what the biggest issues in the country are today. But before we get to that, first let's talk about what the biggest issues were back in 2016, because a lot has happened in 4 years. According to a Pew Research Center study, the top 4 issues, according to voters in 2016, were the economy, foreign policy, terrorism, and healthcare. Since terrorism and foreign policy go somewhat hand in hand, let's talk about those first. To jog our memory, in 2016, ISIS was the biggest threat in regards to a terrorist activity. As for foreign policy over the last 4 years, both critics and supporters of the Trump administration agree that the U.S. has changed its style on foreign policy by retreating as a global leader and having an enhanced focus on national sovereignty. This is likely what Trump means with his slogan, America First. However, the agreement usually ends there, as some see this as a negative step in the wrong direction and others see it as a positive, necessary change. While we can't know exactly what Hillary would have done in regards to foreign policy, her time spent as Secretary of State under the Obama administration, as well as her stated policy goals in her 2016 campaign, give us some insight. Jackson and Lily, why don't you guys start and get us going with what Trump has or hasn't done in regards to foreign policy and terrorism, and what Hillary may have done differently or similarly?
Okay, so I think, first of all, I think it's good that Trump is focused on putting, his America First slogan. And I don't think she would have done the same. I think she would have taken the approach that Bill Clinton kind of took against, terrorism. And whenever they had an attack, his approach failed. The U.S. never really stood up for themselves. You know what I mean? So I think that Trump's really working on that.
One of the ways that I would like to compare how Trump and Hillary would have basically performed on the world stage is by looking at two somewhat similar situations. First, so when Hillary Clinton was the head of the State Department, she was head of the State Department that was presiding over the Benghazi incident, where 4 American lives were lost on September 11th, and not 2001, but in September 11th. And there was a request by the embassy to have further security, and it was denied by the State Department, and they claimed the heads of the State Department to claim that they had never gotten funding. And then after Trump had killed Qasem Soleimani, there was a planned attack on the embassy in the same region that Soleimani was killed, and Donald Trump sent forces to disperse the crowd that was storming the embassy. So that's one of the ways that I would like to compare how Clinton and Trump would have performed differently from one another.
I think on the whole idea of foreign policy and terrorism, that those that acknowledge that Trump has done a really good job in foreign policies specifically focus on how good of a job he's done concerning ISIS and eliminating kind of the strongholds that ISIS has over the Middle East. But I don't think that Hillary would have done anything that differently. I guess responding directly to Lily, in her opinion that he would have taken a Bill Clinton approach to terrorism. Brookings notes in 2016, basically while she was campaigning against Trump, that she supported Barack Obama's decisions to deploy more special forces and intensify airstrikes against ISIS, and that many of her advisors were, hypothetical advisors were prominent advocates of increased use of the military, particularly in Syria. So I really don't think on the topic of terrorism that Trump has such a different idea and such different success than what Hillary would have had. Also, just generally, I think that the two really differ in how they treat alliances, especially with the whole America First ideology. We've definitely gone more isolationist, really distanced ourselves from the partners that we had, and I guess in a sense still have. But that's something that Hillary would have kind of extremely focused on. She thought that having allies and how we treated our allies was one of the best things that we could have done, and was something that was pretty integral to foreign policy. Whereas Trump has really isolated a lot of our allies, not only just our close neighbors, Canada and Mexico, but then also allies over in Asia, by removing us from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and then also things like the Paris Climate Accords, just kind of generally removing us from situations where we could serve as maybe a leader or a partner with other countries, and really taking a step back to kind of isolate ourselves from those countries.
Jake said it really well that Hillary's results probably would have been similar to Trump's or very comparable. And definitely wanted to talk about the allyships. We have become very isolated. And in 2016, Hillary stated that one of the goals she had was to pursue diplomatic strategy again when resolving Syria's civil war and the Iraq conflict. And then she also wanted to pursue relationships with local Arabic and Kurdish forces in order of all coming together to help defeat ISIS. She had a much more together plan. But overall, when you're looking at Trump's plan in 2016 and Hillary's plan in 2016, they both had the same goal, and their plans, while different in detail, were the same overall.
So for the Paris Climate Accord, what my understanding is that the reason he pulled out other countries weren't paying their fair share into the agreement, in that he wanted to back out because there weren't, if other countries were paying their fair share, why should we technically pay ours when we're reducing our emissions? And some of those countries weren't paying their fair share in taxes and reducing.
Okay, so we touched on terrorism and foreign policy. The two other big issues were the economy and healthcare. Do you guys have anything to add in regards to those two issues? Emily, you wanna add about healthcare?
The healthcare system that the Obama administration has implemented has been critiqued and threatened over the past 4 years, but no major changes have enacted yet. And so it's definitely something that people are worried about coming up. And I think that is one of the importance of the 2020 election, is that the threat of a lot of people losing their health care is on the line with this election. But I don't feel like any drastic changes have been made in the past 4 years regarding the Affordable Care Act.
Lily and Jackson, do you want to respond?
I think he doesn't want to just completely get rid of it. I think his plan, I looked into it, I think his plan was more to fix it, kind of, change it. Mm-hmm. Obviously not get rid of the entire thing, but I think that'd be a good idea.
I would just follow up to what Lily said, and the idea of changing it, right? What he wants to do is give more power to private insurance. But that's kind of the thing that deprives a lot of people from access to healthcare in the first place. Is that if you change Obamacare in the way that he wants to, or I guess the Affordable Care Act is more commonly known, if you change it the way that Trump wants to, I think that you specifically target low-income households, people that rely on the Affordable Care Act to have that access to healthcare. There are a lot of people that if they didn't have that, they'd know that they couldn't go to the hospital, regardless of what illness or what injury. They wouldn't go because they know the cost would exceed what they were able to pay. So I think by changing it, you do disenfranchise a large group, a large section of America, people that really need the program in its entirety in order to have that access to healthcare.
So, with Amy Coney Barrett's nomination, there's been talk of the Affordable Care Act being overturned. So, my question is, do you guys think it will get overturned now that we have the conservative majority on the Supreme Court?
This isn't the most educated guess because it's honestly something I haven't looked into as far as like where it stands judicially. But I would expect it not to be. I feel like the Affordable Care Act doesn't violate parts of the Constitution. And I mean, Amy Coney Barrett is an originalist, so that's what she's kind of looking at, as are other members of the Supreme Court. So I don't think that her election really tips the scales in that regard.
I don't think it will, especially given the current circumstances with COVID-19. So many people, and especially with schools opening up, local universities, so many people are getting sick and need health care. And I think that the pushback from the public and the public pressure of protecting health care and insurance and making sure it can be affordable will be so great that I do believe. And like Jake said, I don't think there's anything unconstitutional about it, so I don't think it will get overturned.
So, would you say the Democrats' outspoken disapproval of her nomination and confirmation process was an overreaction? Or do you think Roe v. Wade played more of an important role than the Affordable Care Act? Or what are your thoughts on her nomination and confirmation?
I don't think it's an overreaction because I definitely think the threat is there. But I also think that when we're talking about Roe v. Wade, that is a different that's a different thing in general. Because when we bring Roe v. Wade into it, we start also bringing in religious ties and people's personal beliefs. But I think in terms of just healthcare in general, that I don't think the Affordable Care Act will get overturned.
I agree. I don't believe it'll be overturned. I believe that it may be like reformed, or there may be things in it that are critiqued to make like privatized healthcare more competitive, adding suppliers to make the market more competitive, which would then lower costs. But I don't think it'll be overturned. I think it would be more reformed.
So, having discussed what the major issues were in 2016, let's talk about what the biggest issue facing our country today is. So, Jake and Emily, why don't you guys start? And if you had to narrow it down to one, what do you think is the biggest issue facing our country today?
I think Emily and I have similar answers on this, so I don't need to steal her whole thunder. But it is the division that exists in the United States, whether it be political or ideological or social. I think that there's more than just one form of division that exists, but the fact maybe even that they all exist at the same time right now, I think is the biggest concern to the United States.
I agree, especially when you see on social media people supporting or actively voicing their disapproval of political candidates. I believe that the 2016 election has made us so polarized that a lot of people can't find respect for the other party. No matter what your political affiliations are, everyone has clung so tightly to theirs that they can't respect people, or that a lot of people aren't respecting people with different beliefs. And I believe that started in 2016 and it has continued and strengthened over the past 4 years.
I agree with that. That's what I said for, what I think the biggest issue is right now is the divide, especially between like the parties and political beliefs. Because it's gotten to the point where people are so focused on their side that they won't even look at the policies. They won't even, actually think into the policies. They just think that's something that's on the other side. I don't want to be any part of that. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's making people hate each other, and it's causing a lot of violence and just hate in general. And I don't think it's necessary. I think it's a problem.
I definitely agree with the divisiveness in this country, like the divide in the country. For me, I noticed the biggest divide was along like racial lines. That was what I've noticed personally, but I also agree with like the division between parties as well.
It seems we almost overwhelmingly agree that the various types of division are the biggest problems in our country. Let's dive into what led up to this division. And do we think that Hillary would have exacerbated this division, or would she have lessened it?
I believe that had Hillary won, we'd still have division. I do believe that there are some aspects to the president that aren't perfect, and I do agree that things that he says that do come off as divisive. I do believe, though, as well, that Hillary can also say things that could come off as divisive. And I definitely do think that the media does a great job of dividing us. That's where I see like a lot of division, is because we have like so many different like news sources all saying different things, and like we have one news source on this side and one news source on the other saying two completely different things.
I also think the media plays a big role in it. I think on both sides, not just one side. I think it's extremely biased, and that causes a lot of like confusion between people, which causes arguing. And I think that, I don't know how to say it. I think that if Hillary had won, there would still be division. I don't think as much personally, because I think the media has taken this out of hand, and because Trump won, so they're kind of like, I don't know how to explain it.
Yeah,
I think it's worse that Trump won. I don't think it would have been as bad as Hillary won.
Yeah. Do you think the media feels remorse in the sense that maybe they allowed Trump to win, and so they're trying to
Yeah.
now? Is that what you're saying, kind of?
Yeah.
Definitely think we would be stronger off if Hillary. I do not believe the divide would have been as big. I agree with both Jackson and Lily that there would still be some divide. I do believe that the language the president has used when talking about the other party is definitely, the Democrats, has definitely made the divide a little bit wider. And I also acknowledge that every president, they must talk about both political parties, but I do feel like word choice and such strong words have definitely made the divide wider. And, as Lily and Jackson also pointed out, when you take those sentences with, such harsh claims and critiques, and then it gets, exploited everywhere on the internet, that definitely makes for a large divide. I do believe if Hillary had been president, she wouldn't have made so many radical claims, whether they be true or false, but I don't believe those would have been as exploited as much because they wouldn't have been as radical. So the divide wouldn't have been as great had Hillary been president, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely do want to preface by saying, and I think that kind of we've all mentioned this, that if Hillary had gotten elected, that doesn't mean the polarization would have gone away, that we all be on the same page. That's just not possible with the winner take all election. But I do think that both in what Trump does, says, and just empirically, we're at the greatest point of polarization that maybe we've almost ever had. Gallup just released a poll that showed that there's an 89-point differential between the approval rating of Trump and from Republicans as concerned to Democrats. So it was about a 91% approval rate from Republicans, and then a 2% approval rating from Democrats. And that's the greatest that they've ever had in history of any poll that they've had. Additionally, about 12% of Americans from Pew Research Center study are really satisfied with how America is right now. So I think that those things mean that a lot of people are unhappy, but there are a lot of people that are unsure of where the unhappiness comes from. Personally, when you look at policies like separating parents from their children at the border, the harsh travel ban that got implemented that kind of increased the atmosphere of Islamophobia or xenophobia in this country. And then additionally, I think that Trump's wishy-washy or just not taking a firm stance on white power groups and white power movements, especially those that were outspoken in their support for him. I think that contributes just to a general atmosphere of xenophobia among his supporters. And because of that, whether he intended to or didn't, I think that a lot of his supporters are not the people that feel like they're being disenfranchised in America right now. So specifically minorities, members of the LGBTQ community. I think that those people were a lot bigger supporters of Hillary and kind of would be part of her base had she been elected. So I think that if she were president, that those people would feel like they had an advocate or a representative as the president, as the leader of this country, as opposed to now where they feel like the president is really doing things against them to only kind of hurt their equality that they have.
So one of the biggest divides that is almost in blatant opposition is the Blue Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter thing. It seems you have to be on one side or the other. And so my question is there an undertone at these protests and riots? Is there an undertone of hatred towards Trump and the system that elected him? Or is it genuinely about police brutality? In other words, if Hillary was president, would the protests be in such full force? Would the reaction have been the same, starting with George Floyd's death? How much of it is police brutality, and how much is there an undertone of hatred towards Trump and the system that elected him?
Can I start? Is it okay if I start?
No.
Okay, so like I was saying earlier, I think the media is, a lot of the media, not all of it, some of it is biased towards the right, but a lot of the media is biased towards the left, and they're still mad that Trump won. And I think that they took advantage. I think that they're taking advantage of the fact that they can get people angry, that they can get people worked up and protesting and, you know, doing all this stuff, because that's what they're doing. They're, you know, kind of promoting it almost.
I'd love to respond to that. I definitely think the protests would still be going on, and there would be such a large movement at hand, even if Hillary had been president. The president cannot change police brutality, and police brutality has been going on, you know, and way before Trump became president. Racial targeting goes back to the war on drugs in the 90s, and this is nothing new. I think it would still continue. I do think the handling of all the protests and the reactions to George Floyd's death and other judicial steps would have been taken differently under the Clinton administration. But I do think we'd still have the protest, and I don't believe the media has impacted the protest. I think it's actually helped them in a way that has been able to unify people through the Blackout Tuesday and other ways. A lot of people have been able to peacefully protest through the media. So I think the media has actually helped the movement. And I do believe the movement would have still existed under the Clinton administration.
I just wanted to go back and touch on the point of the media helping the protests. So I definitely think that social media was a way for people to express their opinions on it. And I think that's a good way to do it. We can is out there and stuff like that, and people can see our ideas. But the one area I disagreed with is I don't think the media itself helped the protests. There was that CNN coverage of the Jacob Blake protests in Kenosha, which said fiery but mostly peaceful protests in the background, and there was a fire going on behind the guy giving the report. And we've seen a lot of riots and a lot of looting happening at these Black Lives Matter protests. And I definitely think that it started off more for police brutality. It's evolved into more than just police brutality. I think it's evolved into definitely a dislike towards Donald Trump and more of just a hate towards the system, which I can understand. There are policies in the system that have been implemented that have hurt the African American community in the past. But I think one of the policies that I've seen from the Clinton administration was that 1994 crime bill that hurt African Americans. And Hillary Clinton was in support of that. And during that time, she was quoted as saying about African American kids, they are not just gangs of kids anymore. She said they are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel. So she was also quoted as calling them super predators as well during discussions of the 1994 crime bill, which I think doesn't necessarily help her case. And it doesn't, I think she would have reacted a little bit of a different way to the protests, but we've seen the protests go on during Obama's administration, and then he called protesters in Baltimore thugs, and that was covered completely different than when Donald Trump called the protesters thugs. So I think that there is a double standard within media.
I think that it's interesting to try and bring up rhetoric concerning this because there are so many clips, bits, that whatever you can find of Trump's disparaging comments against pretty much everyone that's not white or male. So I do think that, yes, while Clinton was recorded saying super predators 26 years ago, I don't think that necessarily applies to how she would have treated something that happened today. I think that she would have done a lot better job of recognizing kind of the pain and suffering, and instead of labeling a whole group of people as looters and rioters, recognizing that existed and that should be stopped, but then also supporting the Black Lives Matter movement kind of at its base. I think that that's something that Trump will not do, or at least not explicitly will not do. And so I think that So Caroline, going back to your question, I don't think that there was necessarily an undertone of anger that created this. But I do think after having the Black Lives Matter protest and seeing how Trump responded, that the anger only intensified because of how poorly he handled it and kind of how poorly he related to the people that were trying to speak up and explain, how much hurt had been caused by the systematic racism, by the police brutality. So I do think if Hillary were president, then it would be handled a lot better. And so I think that anger that came after would have never happened.
So do you guys think this idea that you have to either support one or the other has gotten almost out of control? And if so, who's at fault? Whose fault is that? Is that Trump's fault? Is it the media's fault? Was it a phenomenon? And my big question is it possible to support both? Or are they so in opposition that by supporting one, you inherently disapprove of the other? Is it possible to support both?
No, I think that there doesn't need to be it's Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter. I think that you can definitely say that police are important to the country. Police are important to stop crime, but that there is some issue with some policemen, and I think that there is an issue with the system in general as far as the laws and how they're written and kind of how people are judged and the color of your skin and how that affects the sentence you received, how often you're stopped, how you're treated when you're stopped. I don't think any of that has to do with police are a bad thing or that it just has to be police or it has to be Black Lives Matter. I think the two can definitely coexist. And I think Hillary would have done a lot better job at bridging the gap between the two to not make it one against the other.
I find it really interesting when everyone always says it has to be Blue Lives Matter or Black Lives Matter. And I understand where both viewpoints are coming from. And I think the issue that a lot of Democrats take with Blue Lives Matter is that you're saying that police officers are just as great of a threat and as Black lives are, is that they're police officers who are being just as much like discrimination or like under as much threat for their lives as Black lives are. And as statistics have showed us, that's not true. While they are under a great deal of threat, it is important. But I do believe that people equalize them when just basic statistics show us that they're not being marginalized as much as Black lives are.
Do you guys think that there's generalizations happening where everybody on the right thinks that everybody on the left is saying that all cops are bad and they want to burn the cities down and riot and loot, and everybody on the left thinks that everybody on the right is either a racist or is in denial that racism exists? When in reality, both of those are relatively small groups on each side from what I've experienced. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I think that's the big issue kind of that we're getting back to is that with polarization, that a lot of times the people that speak the loudest are the people that are the furthest extreme in one direction or the other. And especially with the whole idea of, fake news and then the media countering fake news, I think that there's really no one trusts exactly what they read, as Jackson and Lily have mentioned. And so it makes it harder to find, it makes it a lot harder to find one voice or one headline that encompasses a whole entire political side. When I think that there are a lot in between. And really what gets amplified is the furthest extreme versions of what a whole group thinks.
Okay, I think that's a great stopping point, where we were kind of able to recognize like how important it is to see the individual and hear each other out and not just lump one another in, because it's so easy to get wrapped up on this side or that side, especially with the social media. And I think at the end of the day, most of us are pretty moderate, pretty reasonable people who don't think that all cops are bad, don't make outrageous statements like that, or don't say that racism has been completely eradicated. I think that's very small, just like Jake said, that's a very small group and they're just talking the loudest. So I consider this a success. I hope you guys did too. Comment below what you guys think on everything. Give us your brutal feedback, and comment what other videos you'd like us to do. Next week, we will be doing a little roundtable discussion about what it's really like to be a conservative in college during the Trump era. So it'll be like half the team will be participating. We'll just be sitting around kind of sharing our experiences of what it's like to be a conservative in college in actuality. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that one. And we will see you next week. Thank you.